I had spent 2 years grieving a husband I believed died in a mine collapse, and had finally agreed to remarry, when Obadiah Finch, the town undertaker who had prepared my husband's body for burial 2 years before, pulled me aside that very wedding morning and told me, in a hushed, urgent voice, that the man buried in my husband's grave had never actually been my husband at all. A revelation that arrived with barely minutes to spare before I would have spoken vows to another man entirely unaware of the considerable truth unraveling just beyond the church doors. My name is Margaret Talbot, though everyone called me Meg, and I was 27 years old that particular spring morning, standing in the small back room of our church in my wedding dress, minutes from marrying Franklin Doyle, a genuinely kind local rancher who had courted me patiently for the better part of a year, when Obadiah Finch appeared at the door with an expression that immediately told me something considerable had gone wrong before he'd spoken a single word. I had spent the previous evening in the particular quiet reflection of a woman preparing herself, properly and finally, to marry again, understanding that the grief I had carried these 2 years deserved that particular honest examination before I allowed myself to move forward into a new life alongside Franklin. My first husband, Gideon Talbot, had died 2 years before in a collapse at the Sentinel Claim, the modest but genuinely promising silver mine he'd staked in the hills above our small Colorado mining town. A collapse the county's official investigation had ruled a tragic accident, the particular kind of danger that made mining work considerably more perilous than most other frontier occupations. Gideon had staked that claim 3 years into our marriage, a modest but genuinely promising vein of silver ore that had, in the months before his supposed death, begun producing considerably more valuable yield than either of us had originally anticipated when he'd first filed the paperwork. The body recovered from that collapse had been damaged enough that Obadiah Finch had recommended, with the particular gentle professional care I remembered him showing throughout that terrible week, a closed casket, sparing me what he described as details no widow needed carrying alongside her grief. I remember trusting his careful, kind judgment entirely at the time, grateful for a professional's gentle guidance through a week I could barely properly navigate on my own. If Obadiah's confession that morning proved true, I stood to lose considerably more than simply my composure minutes before a wedding I had spent months carefully preparing myself to properly want. I stood to lose the entire settled understanding of my own life these past 2 years, the grief I had worked so carefully to process, the grave I had visited faithfully, the whole architecture of loss I had built my subsequent healing upon. All of it suddenly resting on a foundation Obadiah Finch was telling me, with visible terror at his own confession, had never actually been true. I remember, in that first disorienting moment, feeling the particular vertigo of a woman whose entire understanding of the past 2 years had just been declared unreliable, uncertain which parts of her own carefully constructed grief could still be trusted. "I need you to listen carefully and quickly," Obadiah said, his voice low and urgent, glancing repeatedly toward the door as though expecting interruption at any moment. "The body I prepared and buried under your husband's name 2 years ago was not Gideon. It was an unidentified transient laborer who died of natural causes the same week as the mine collapse, a man with no family to claim him and no particular resemblance beyond similar general build. I used his body because Gideon asked me to, Meg, because Gideon was alive after that collapse, badly injured but alive, and needed the county to believe him dead in order to escape a danger I did not properly understand myself until considerably later." He glanced toward the door once more, his weathered face carrying the particular strain of a man delivering a confession he had rehearsed many times in his own mind, but never actually expected to speak aloud. I want to record that my first reaction was not relief, but a particular disorienting fury, the specific anger of discovering that 2 years of genuine grief had been constructed on a deliberate deception, however desperately motivated. "You're telling me my husband has been alive these 2 years, I said, my voice considerably harder than I generally allowed it to sound, and that you knew, and said nothing, while I visited an empty grave and slowly rebuilt my entire life around a death that never actually happened. You watched me grieve him properly, Obadiah. You attended the funeral you yourself helped stage. I don't yet understand how to properly process the particular cruelty of that, however genuine your reasons eventually proved to be. I made him a promise," Obadiah said, "the same week as the collapse, when he came to me half-conscious and terrified, convinced that Thaddeus Brock had deliberately caused that collapse to kill him and would try again if he learned Gideon had survived. I believed him, Meg. I'd seen enough of Brock's dealings with smaller claim holders these past years to believe considerably worse of him than most of this town was willing to properly examine, and I made the choice, in that terrible urgent hour, to help Gideon disappear, rather than risk delivering him back into danger I genuinely believed would finish what the collapse had started. I want to explain, plainly, the situation Gideon had apparently uncovered before that collapse, because understanding it properly is the whole of what eventually explained 2 years of silence I had spent believing was simply death's own silence, rather than a living man's careful hiding. Thaddeus Brock, the region's dominant mine owner, had been systematically defrauding smaller claim holders throughout our district, manipulating survey boundaries and county filing records to gradually absorb the most promising smaller claims into his own considerable holdings, a scheme Gideon had apparently discovered evidence of in the weeks before the collapse. Evidence he had been quietly gathering with the intention of presenting to territorial mining authorities. Brock's particular method, Obadiah explained, involved bribing county surveyors to file slightly altered boundary descriptions, small enough discrepancies that individual claim holders rarely noticed until Brock's own considerably larger operation had already absorbed the disputed acreage through careful accumulated legal maneuvering. Gideon believed, and I came to believe alongside him, Obadiah told me, that Brock had learned of his investigation and arranged the collapse specifically to eliminate him before that evidence could be properly presented. Gideon survived only because he'd been working the claim's outer tunnel that particular morning, rather than the main shaft where the collapse actually occurred, injured badly enough that he genuinely might not have survived a second, more deliberate attempt on his life, which is precisely what he feared Brock would arrange the moment his survival became known. A fear I found, upon considerable reflection, entirely reasonable given everything I already privately suspected about Brock's ruthless business practices. Obadiah's hands trembled slightly as he continued, the particular visible strain of a man finally releasing a burden he had carried carefully concealed for 2 considerable years. I have not slept properly most nights since, Meg, weighing my promise to Gideon against the particular cruelty of watching you grieve so genuinely for something that was never, in the end, entirely true. I sat with this considerable explanation for a long moment, working through the particular cascading implications of everything Obadiah was describing, understanding, slowly, that my 2 years of grief had been not simply a deception, but a genuinely desperate man's only available protection against a danger considerably more real than I had properly appreciated until this exact urgent conversation. The particular strangeness of standing in my own wedding dress while absorbing news that fundamentally rewrote 2 years of my own understood reality struck me, even in that overwhelming moment, as something I would likely need years to properly process in full. Where is he now? I asked. If he's genuinely alive, and why has he waited 2 entire years to properly return and explain any of this himself? 2 years, Obadiah. That is considerably longer than any genuine danger should reasonably have required, whatever the actual threat Brock posed. He's here, Obadiah said. In town, arrived just this morning, having spent these 2 years gathering considerably more thorough evidence against Brock than what he'd managed before the collapse. Evidence he believes finally sufficient to bring proper charges that will actually hold, rather than simply provoking Brock into another attempt on his life before authorities could properly intervene. He asked me to tell you the truth before your wedding proceeded, Meg, understanding the considerable unfairness of arriving with this news at the very last possible moment, but genuinely unable to arrive any sooner without risking the evidence he'd need to finally end Brock's danger for good. Obadiah's voice carried the particular weight of a man who had clearly argued this same defense with himself many times over the preceding 2 years, rehearsing justifications he still found only partially adequate to the considerable pain his silence had caused. I want to record that I did not immediately know what to do with this considerable, overwhelming information, standing in my wedding dress with Franklin Doyle waiting, entirely unaware, at the altar just beyond that small back room's door. I understood, with a clarity that arrived considerably faster than I expected given the shock of everything else, that I could not, in good conscience, proceed with marrying Franklin while genuinely uncertain whether my first husband remained alive, whatever the considerable awkwardness of interrupting a wedding already fully underway, and whatever explanation I would eventually owe the assembled guests waiting patiently in the pews beyond. I found Franklin myself, before the ceremony could properly begin, and told him, as plainly as the considerable complexity allowed, that I could not marry him that day, that circumstances had arisen requiring my immediate attention that I did not yet fully understand myself. I want to record that Franklin Doyle received this news with a grace I had not properly appreciated until that exact difficult moment, understanding, somehow, without my needing to explain the full considerable strangeness of the actual situation, that whatever had arisen was genuinely serious rather than simple wedding day nerves. I remember his face doing the particular careful work of a genuinely decent man setting aside his own considerable disappointment to properly attend to what his intended clearly needed in that moment, a kindness I did not fully appreciate the weight of until considerably later. I trust your judgment, Meg, he said, whatever this concerns. I'd rather you take whatever time you genuinely need than proceed today out of simple obligation to a ceremony neither of us should want continued under circumstances you're clearly not prepared to properly explain right now." He paused, studying my face with genuine concern rather than wounded pride. "Whatever you eventually decide, about today or about anything else, I want you to know I hold no resentment toward you for however this resolves. I've watched you these past months, Meg, and I've always understood there was a considerable grief still settled somewhere I couldn't properly reach, whatever genuine affection had grown between us alongside it." I found Gideon waiting at Obadiah's own modest house at the edge of town, considerably thinner and more weathered than the husband I remembered, a jagged new scar along his hairline testifying plainly to the genuine danger Obadiah had described, and I want to record that seeing him standing there, unmistakably alive after 2 years of genuine mourning, produced an emotional collision I had no proper preparation for, relief and fury and grief all arriving simultaneously with a force that left me genuinely unsteady on my feet. I stood in Obadiah's small doorway for what felt like considerable time simply looking at him. This man I had properly buried and mourned, now standing before me with the particular careful stillness of someone uncertain whether he was welcome, the 2 years between us stretching out like a distance neither of us yet knew how to properly close. "I understand I have no right to ask anything of you," Gideon said, standing carefully still, the particular posture of a man uncertain whether approaching me would be welcomed or resisted. "I understand 2 years is considerably longer than any reasonable person should expect a wife to wait on faith alone, and I understand you were minutes from marrying a good man when Obadiah's confession interrupted everything. I only needed you to know the truth, Meg, whatever you eventually decide to do with it." His voice caught slightly on my name, the particular small tell of a man who had rehearsed considerable composure for this exact moment and found it harder to maintain than he'd properly anticipated. "You let me bury you," I said, "and grieve you, and slowly rebuild an entire life believing myself widowed for 2 years, when you were alive this whole time gathering evidence against a man who tried to kill you. I understand your reasons, Gideon. I do not yet understand how to properly forgive 2 years of grief that never needed to happen at all, however genuinely dangerous your actual circumstances were." I felt my own composure straining considerably as I spoke, the particular exhausting effort of holding together genuine relief and genuine fury in the same breath. Gideon was quiet a long moment, absorbing this with the particular careful stillness of a man who had clearly anticipated exactly this response and had no ready defense against its considerable fairness. "I don't ask forgiveness today," he said. "I ask only that you know the truth, and that you understand I never once, in 2 years of hiding, stopped believing I'd eventually return to properly explain it, whatever cost that explanation carried for both of us." The confrontation with Thaddeus Brock came 3 days later, once Gideon's gathered evidence had been properly presented to territorial mining authorities, summoned specifically for the purpose. Evidence considerably more thorough than his original investigation had managed, including sworn testimony from 2 other smaller claim holders Brock had similarly defrauded, and a paper trail of falsified survey records that left little room for the confident denial Brock initially attempted. Gideon had spent those 2 years, I learned, traveling between several territorial counties, quietly gathering additional victims of Brock's scheme, willing to testify once properly assured of protection, a considerably more patient and thorough investigation than the hurried evidence he'd gathered before the original collapse. "This entire account rests on the word of a man officially dead for 2 years, Brock said, when confronted directly by territorial officials in the county courthouse, his composure considerably more strained than his confident opening statement suggested. "I'd think a man's own fake death raises rather more questions about his credibility than about my own considerable standing in this district. I've built this region's mining economy from nothing, gentlemen, employed half this county's working men at one point or another. I'd ask you weigh that considerable contribution against the unsupported accusations of a man who spent 2 years hiding rather than facing his supposed evidence like an honest citizen." "My death was faked," Gideon said, "specifically because you arranged a mine collapse intended to kill me before I could present exactly this evidence, Mr. Brock. I'd invite the territorial investigators to properly examine the Sentinel Claims collapse tunnel structure, which I have reason to believe, upon closer geological examination, shows clear evidence of deliberate charge placement rather than the natural instability your own convenient explanation claimed at the time." Gideon's voice remained steady throughout, the particular controlled composure of a man who had spent 2 years rehearsing exactly this confrontation and was determined not to let 2 years of careful preparation unravel under Brock's practiced intimidation. The subsequent territorial investigation, which took the better part of 2 months to properly conclude, confirmed exactly what Gideon had alleged. Deliberate sabotage of the Sentinel claims structural supports consistent with an intentional collapse rather than natural mining hazard. Evidence combined with the fraud testimony sufficient to see Brock formally arrested and eventually convicted on charges considerably more serious than the claim-jumping fraud alone had originally warranted. The investigators' geological report, when it finally arrived, confirmed Gideon's suspicion in considerable technical detail, describing charge placement patterns entirely inconsistent with the natural rock stress fractures a genuine accident would have produced. Findings that a visiting mining engineer from the Territorial Survey Office testified to personally before the assembled court, lending Gideon's account the particular weight of independent expert confirmation that his own testimony alone, however genuine, could never have properly provided against a man of Brock's considerable local standing. I want to record that the months following Gideon's return were not simple. Whatever justice I eventually found in watching Brock's considerable local power finally collapse under the weight of his own genuine crimes. I had genuinely grieved a husband I now had to properly reconcile with as a living, changed man, someone who had survived 2 years of hiding and hardship in ways that had altered him as thoroughly as my own 2 years of mourning had altered me. There were evenings, that first month, when I found myself genuinely uncertain how to properly speak with a man I had spent 2 years addressing only in quiet, private conversations at his own grave marker. A strange disorientation I had not properly anticipated even after Obadiah's initial confession had prepared me for the basic fact of Gideon's survival. "I don't require you to simply resume where we left off," Gideon told me, some weeks into this careful reconciliation, both of us sitting on the porch of the small house we'd once shared, now standing empty and unused these 2 years. "I understand 2 years apart changed us both considerably, and I'm prepared to properly court you again, Meg, as though we were beginning entirely fresh, if that's what genuine healing actually requires." He looked out at the small yard, overgrown now from 2 years of neglect, the particular visible evidence of a life interrupted mid-sentence. "I spent considerable time these 2 years imagining this exact conversation, and I find the reality considerably more complicated than anything I properly rehearsed, which I suppose is simply what genuine reconciliation actually requires, rather than the clean, simple reunion I'd perhaps foolishly imagined. I found, over the following months, that I genuinely appreciated this particular patience, Gideon's willingness to let our marriage rebuild itself gradually rather than simply assuming 2 years of separation could be dismissed as though they'd never happened. We spent those months in the particular careful rhythm of two people relearning each other, evening conversations on that same porch, Gideon slowly sharing more of what those 2 years of hiding had actually required of him, difficult work in distant mining camps under assumed names, the particular loneliness of a man unable to properly explain to anyone why he'd disappeared so completely from his own previous life, a loneliness he told me, more than once, had been considerably harder to bear than the physical danger itself. We remarried formally that following spring, in a small ceremony considerably different from the wedding that had been interrupted, Franklin Doyle attending with genuine grace, and, I later learned, considerable relief at having been spared marrying a woman whose heart, however sincerely she'd tried, had never fully released its claim on the husband she'd believed dead. Franklin married, within the following year, a considerably suited young widow from a neighboring county, and I received word occasionally through mutual acquaintances that his own marriage prospered in exactly the settled, genuine way I had come, with some relief of my own, to understand ours might never have properly managed, whatever genuine affection had existed between us during our brief courtship. I still keep Obadiah Finch's original burial ledger, the one containing the false entry that eventually unraveled this entire considerable deception, in a small drawer alongside our own marriage certificate, and some evenings, watching Gideon work our modest claim with the same careful attention he once brought to gathering evidence against Brock. I understand more clearly each year that grief, however genuinely felt, is not always the same thing as truth, and that the truest kindness a frightened man can eventually offer is simply choosing, however belatedly, to finally tell it plainly. Obadiah himself remained our close friend through the years that followed, and I came, gradually, to properly forgive the particular impossible position his promise to Gideon had placed him in, understanding that a man caught between loyalty and honesty rarely finds a path through that particular dilemma without cost to someone he genuinely cares for.